Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from The Hindu and The Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to India-Russia ties. As the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is scheduled to visit Russia, and this visit comes against the backdrop of a perceived strain in the India-USA ties due to the non-finalization of the India-US trade deal. The second article is related to the exclusion of the creamy layer from the benefits of reservation for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as the Supreme Court has issued the notice to the centre regarding a petition filed for the same. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to India-Russia ties. The context behind it is that the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is going to visit Russia. This visit comes at a time when the India-USA ties are going through a strain. The India-US trade deal has not been finalized. USA has imposed 25% tariffs upon India. On top of that, another 25% has been imposed as penalty upon India. The penalty for buying oil from Russia. Also, the remarks of President Trump of USA have not been very cordial towards India. They are even trying to hyphenate India and Pakistan. For example, USA even invited the Pakistan military chief to USA, ignoring India's concerns. So, India wants to deepen the engagement with Russia. So, we will discuss the evolution of the India-Russia relations, the significance of Russia for India, the challenges in the India-Russia relations and its potential. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. First, let's start with the evolution of India-Russia relations. We can categorize the historical evolution into 4 phases broadly. The first phase being the pre-1971 era. India got independence in 1947. After that, there was an initial phase in the India-Russia relations when India was viewed with a little suspicion. The Stalin era, Stalin viewed India with a little distrust initially because he viewed India as being semi-liberated from Britain rather than being completely independent. But there was a thaw in the relations between India and Russia. The India-Russia relations warmed up after the Stalin era as Khrushchev gave an outreach towards India. He came to the aid of India, for example, the industrial aid like the help in the setting up of the Bhilai steel plant, the signing of the 1953 commercial agreement. Even when Pakistan was making remarks regarding the inclusion of the United Nations forces in Kashmir to demilitarize Kashmir, at that time Russia was against the opinions of Pakistan and Russia supported India at that time. And when there was the India-China war, the Sino-Indian war in 1962, initially Russia was supporting China, but later on, gradually but steadily, the support of Russia shifted from China towards India. Even China accused Russia at that time of violating the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty because Russia had supplied aircraft to India in 1961, and therefore the military dependence of India upon Russia was gradually increasing, and it increased so much that by mid 1960s about 70% of India's arms were being imported from Russia. Therefore we were dependent upon Russia regarding the arms import. But Russia was also going for a strategic balancing. At that time, it was engaging not only with India but with Pakistan as well. It wanted to counter the influence of the Western nations, particularly the influence of USA there. Therefore, it was engaging with Pakistan also, but it prioritized India over Pakistan. The real push towards the India-Russia relations came after 1971. There was a strengthening of the India-Soviet alliance at that time. For example, the signing of the 1971 Friendship Treaty. This Friendship Treaty was signed before the Bangladesh Liberation War. At that time, USA had refused to come to the support of India in case India was attacked by both China and Pakistan. At that time, Russia came to India's rescue and we signed the Friendship Treaty. And therefore in that phase there was a boom in the relations, in the defense relations also, and in the trade relations as well. The trade between India and Russia increased from less than $500 million in 1973 to more than $3.5 billion by 1985. Likewise, Russia even became the largest arms supplier by 1980s for India. And when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, at that time India although took a stand, but that was a cautious approach, the cautious criticism at that time, because we wanted to continue the import of the arms and oil from Russia, and we also had the friendship treaty. We wanted to hedge our bets and maintain our national interests as well. And after that there was an outrage from the side of Gorbachev also, and that led to the eventual signing of the Kudankulam deal, and he was promoting the cooperation between India and Russia in the space sector, in the defense sector as well. The third phase in the India-Russia ties can be seen from 1991 to 2020. When there was a decline in the Soviet Union, there was also a decline in the trade between India and Russia. The trade declined to the tune of 75% within a couple of years, from 1990 to 1992 itself. But after that, there was a push from the side of President Putin. President Putin went for a strategic push towards India. For example, the signing of the agreement for the co-development of the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, the co-manufacturing of the Kalashnikov AK-203 assault rifles, the selling of the S-400 air defense system to India. The two countries also went for the cooperation across multilateral fora. For example, the calls for a multipolar global order across the fora like BRICS, SCO, etc. And India also simultaneously went for a diversification of the sources for its arms imports. For example, the arms import from Russia came down from 86% in 2012 to 49% in 2014, because India was diversifying sources and exploring USA, France, Israel. From 2020 onwards, the phase can be seen as that of a divergence phase also. And the primary cause behind the strategic divergence from 2020 to 2024 between India and Russia may be due to the China angle as well. For example, India and China have the border tussle as seen in the 2017 Doklam issue, 2020 Galwan Valley skirmishes. But Russia went ahead and signed a no limits partnership with China in 2022, which caused a concern for India. Although Russia might have signed it because it was going for the war with Ukraine. And when there was the Russia-Ukraine war, India, although urged for peace, but we did not vote against Russia at the United Nations resolutions. We abstained there. But the UN abstentions, they were seen by the West to be India's support towards Russia, because we also want to protect our national interests as well. Another factor behind the strategic divergences can be the Pakistan angle also, because Russia sells the arms as well as the equipments to Pakistan as well. For example, the selling of the helicopters to Pakistan, and it even proposed the inclusion of Pakistan in the international north-south transport corridor as well, which again causes concerns for India. At the same time, India was also leaning towards USA. For example, the engagements in terms of the technological development, co-development with USA, like through ISET and the Indus X, etc. And therefore, there was a period of divergence as well. But now again, India and Russia are going to deepen their engagement with each other. Now, what is the significance of Russia for India? Why do we need to deepen our engagement with Russia? Because Russia is important for us from the strategic and diplomatic standpoint, as we want to expand our cooperation across the non-Western forums. For example, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the RIC, Russia, India, China, trilateral. And we have a neighbor right next door, China, which is rising like a regional hegemon. We want to counter their rise, balance their rise through having a counterweight. Therefore, the cooperation with Russia will help us. And we want reforms in the global governance architecture, reforms in the United Nations. For that, cooperation from Russia will be helpful. For example, we want a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, and this view is supported by Russia also, that India should get a seat there. And to ensure that we have the strategic autonomy, we need a multipolar world order. For that, we can support Russia, and therefore that engagement can be across various multilateral fora as well. Another sector why Russia is significant for us is the cooperation in the defense and security. India has been going for the diversification efforts regarding the arms imports, but Russia still remains a major arms supplier. For example, from 2019 to 2023, about 36% of India's arms imports were coming from Russia only. Also, there are various military exercises between India and Russia. For example, Indra, Avia Indra, the Indra Navy, etc. These will promote the interoperability between the two militaries. Also, there is the defense technology collaboration, for example, the joint production, the joint manufacturing of various defense equipments, and there is a legacy dependence also. About 70 to 90% of Indian army's arms and equipment, they are imported from Russia only. Therefore, we need to maintain the ties for their maintenance as well. Another sector why India-Russia ties are significant is the energy cooperation and the economic ties. We import huge quantities of oil from Russia. After the Ukraine war, the import of the Russian oil into India increased by about 10 times. Earlier it was about $5 billion worth of import, then it increased to more than $50 billion worth of imports from 2021 to 2023. Also, the bilateral trade has also surged therefore, and it increased to about $65 billion in 2023, and therefore Russia became India's fourth largest trading partner. There is cooperation in the nuclear development sector also. For example, the investments and the development of the Kudankulam nuclear power plant. And both the countries also want to trade in the local currencies, a push for the de-dollarization rather than being dependent upon the conversion to the US dollar or the other hard currencies. They are promoting the trade through the rupee ruble mechanism. The Russian firms, they have special Vostro accounts in the Indian banks also. Another aspect why India-Russia ties are significant is the need of geopolitical balancing for India, particularly in the current global order. In case there is pressure from the West, then we need an ally on our side. We need a counterweight to that pressure, and Russia can be that counter to the Western pressure. Not only does India benefit from India-Russia cooperation, Russia also gets to benefit because India can provide the alternative to China for Russia, the alternative in Asia as a reliable partner, as a trusted partner. Therefore, the cooperation across the non-Western forums like Shanghai Cooperation Organization will help both, and therefore the connectivity initiatives, for example the International North-South Transport Corridor, will further deepen the cooperation between the two countries, as the International North-South Transport Corridor will bring down the time which is taken for the shipment of the goods between the two countries, as the conventional route is very long whereas the International North-South Transport Corridor will be a shorter route. Another way can also be through the Chennai-Vladivostok Eastern Maritime Corridor. This will be also ensuring the connectivity to the Russia's Far East region. Another factor is the historical and the cultural linkage as well. Historically, we have seen that there have been positive ties between the two countries, and the Cold War legacy has also shown that there is cooperation between India and Russia historically also. For example, the launching of Aryabhatta satellite, the cooperation in the space sector and defense sector, and there have been consistent high-level engagements also. For example, President Putin and Prime Minister Modi met about 17 times in a decade, and there are deepening people to people ties also, for example through cultural exchanges and the business collaborations as well. But there are a few challenges that the India-Russia ties face. For example, India faces the challenges with respect to its foreign policy. We have the dilemma of the participation in Quad versus the non-Western nations. We have to balance our participation in Quad or Indo-Pacific Economic Framework versus the participation in BRICS, SCO, etc. And there is the dilemma with respect to the Ukraine war as well. After the Ukraine war, Russia has been giving oil at discounted prices. So we import oil from Russia, but at the same time the Western nations, they are imposing sanctions upon the Russian entities. We have to protect our national interest, therefore we want to import the oil from Russia at cheap prices, but it has earned India the tag of a laundromat, that we import crude oil at cheap prices from Russia, we process it and then we export it again. At the same time, we have to escape the Western sanctions also while protecting our national interest by importing oil from Russia. Another challenge is in the defense sector, that there is low interoperability between the two militaries, as we have seen through the postponement of the Indra exercises in 2022 and 2023. At the same time, the arms import from Russia has declined. There has been a declining arms dependence as well. Also, the new military deals which are signed, they are fewer. After the acquisition of the S-400 from the Russia, the new large military deals have been scarce. There is the Pakistan angle as well, as Pakistan also imports arms and equipments from Russia, so we have to deal with that factor as well. There is the challenge in the economic sector also. For example, the India Russia trade has increased, it has surged, but it has also led to a surge of the trade deficit as well. The trade deficit touched about $50 billion, and the two countries put in place a rupee ruble deal, that the two countries will be doing trade in the local currencies. But now the Russian firms, they have large surplus amounts in the Indian banks. And there is the challenge of the connectivity as well. There were investments and the developments for the international north-south transport corridor, but there are clashes regarding the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, for example, the Armenia-Azerbaijan region. Now, what is the potential of India-Russia ties and how can it be achieved fully so that India can advance its national interests? One, we need to maintain a strategic balance. In case there is pressure from the West, pressure from USA especially, which it often resorts to by arm twisting the other nations for getting the trade deal signed, then Russia can serve us as an ally. Russia can be the counterweight to the Western pressure. For that, we need to advance our mutual interests. The core mutual interests, they lie in the technological development, the cooperation in technological development, the promotion of trade. And regarding technology, both countries can go for the co-development, co-manufacturing of the military goods, dual-use goods. For that, the Russia has served as a reliable partner for India in the past. We need to counter China also at the same time. For that, we need to be an ally for Russia so that the Russian bear does not enter into the dragon's den. For that, the elephant also needs to save it. And therefore, India can serve as a bridge between Russia and the West, because Russia should not be left aloof in the global order. Rather, India can serve as the link between Russia and the West. We also need to prevent the formation of a Russia-China axis or the Russia-China-Pakistan axis. For that, we need to hedge our bets. And we need to ensure that we are also importing oil from Russia, because it not only gives cheap oil to India, it also ensures the stability in the energy market globally. It brings down the prices of the oil globally, which is beneficial for India because India is an importer of the crude oil. At the same time, we can expand the cooperation in the Arctic region, the investments in the Russia's Far East region. For that, India has given the $1 billion line of credit also. The promotion of the Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor can be done for that. And we need to moderate the engagements in the BRICS and the SCO also, so that these are not seen as anti-West forums, rather they can be promoted as non-West forums. And we can promote simultaneously the RIC also, Russia, India, China trilateral. Now there is a mains practice question as well. Examine the evolving dynamics of India-Russia relations in the post-Ukraine war context and the perceived strain in the India-US ties. Discuss the significance of this partnership for India and the challenges it faces due to the current geopolitical equations. Please try to write it. The next article is related to creamy layer exclusion from the reservation benefits among the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The context behind it is that the Supreme Court has issued notice to the centre on a petition filed regarding the exclusion of creamy layer from reservation benefits among SCs and STs. So we will discuss both the arguments in favor of the exclusion of the creamy layer and the arguments against the exclusion of the creamy layer from reservation benefits and the suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic welfare schemes for the vulnerable sections of the population and the mechanisms, laws, institutions and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections. Before coming to the arguments in favor or against the creamy layer exclusion, let's look at the legal background. One of the earliest precedents was the State of Madras versus Champakam Durai Rajan case. whereby the Madras government had provided for the reservation in the educational institutions. At that time, Article 15 subclause 4 was not inserted into the constitution, and the court held that this provision of reservation in the educational institution will lead to the violation of the right to equality. Therefore, this case led to the first Constitutional Amendment Act, which inserted Article 15 subclause 4 in the constitution, which empowered the state to provide for the special provisions for the backward classes as well as the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes, and it empowered the state therefore to make reservations in the educational institutions also. Then in Indira Sani case in 1992, the court observed that there should be a 50% cap upon the reservations. Simultaneously, there can be the exclusion of the creamy layer from the reservations which are provided for the other backward classes. The 77th Amendment to the Constitution inserted the Article 16 Clause 4A into the Constitution, which provided that even in the promotions, the reservation can be provided for the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. In M. Nagaraj versus Union of India case in 2006, the court held that Article 16 Clause 4A is constitutionally valid, that yes, reservation can be provided for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in promotions as well, but for that state should maintain the proof of backwardness, and there should be quantifiable data that proves the backwardness and therefore the requirement of the reservation in the promotions for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Thereafter, in Jarnail Singh case, the court held that the creamy layer should be excluded from the promotions even for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes also, only for the promotions. Then last year in the state of Punjab versus Davinder Singh case in 2024, the Supreme Court held that the states, they have the power to subclassify the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes also. It overruled the earlier judgment, E.V. Chinnaiya judgment, whereby the court had held earlier in the Chinnaiya case that the scheduled caste, they are a homogeneous group. Therefore, subclassification will lead to the violation of their right to equality. But last year in the Davinder Singh case, the court held that the subclassification of the scheduled caste will not lead to the violation of right to equality. Rather, it will lead to a better targeting of the welfare measures from the state. Therefore, the states have the power to subclassify the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, but it has to be done on an empirical basis. There must be empirical data, it has to be backed by data, and it cannot be done arbitrarily, and the same principles can apply just like the other backward classes also. But the court also held that this subclassification, if done by the states, this will be subject to judicial review to ensure that there is no arbitrary subclassification. And at the same time, the court even proposed that there can be a generational limit also to avail the reservation benefits. For example, if one generation has already availed the reservation benefit and therefore their social status, the standing, economic standing has improved, then they may not be allowed to avail the reservation benefit again. The court even proposed that for these we can have the criterias. For example, the court proposed two models. One is the preferential model for the subclassification and the subsequent targeting of the welfare schemes by the government, and another is the exclusive model. In the preferential model, the court proposed that if there is subclassification, then the most disadvantaged groups, they can be preferred regarding the benefits of the reservation first, and the leftover seats, they can be given to the remaining groups among the scheduled castes or the scheduled tribes. That is, preference first can be given to the most disadvantaged groups within the scheduled caste, within the scheduled tribes, and the remaining seats then allotted to the remaining scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Whereas in the exclusive model, there can be specific quotas which can be framed, as the court proposed that for specific groups within the scheduled caste, specific quotas can also be prescribed by the government. Now, the court also specifically observed, Justice Gavai, who is the present Chief Justice of India, in that case observed that there can be an exclusion for the creamy layer from the benefits which are extended, the reservation benefits for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and the Justice Gavai observed that there can be exclusion for the affluent scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes subgroups. Now let's discuss some arguments both in favor of the creamy layer exclusion and the arguments against the creamy layer exclusion from the reservation benefits among the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. First, the arguments in favor of the exclusion of the creamy layer from reservation benefits. It will lead to social justice. It may improve the social equity as the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged within the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes will be getting the benefits, and it is even be constitutional as well, as it does not violate Article 14, and also the sub-classification does not violate Article 341 as observed by the court also in the State of Punjab versus Davinder Singh case. And it even stated in the case that the constitutional authority is there with the states to sub-classify the scheduled caste for the provision of the welfare benefits for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. At the same time, the court had even observed that it is a social reality that the subgroups within the scheduled caste, they are not having the equal standing, equal economic status or equal social status also, and various caste surveys, for example the caste survey in Bihar has also pointed out that some groups within the scheduled caste, they have higher percentages, higher levels of professional qualifications and higher educational qualifications as compared to the other groups, and this will even lead to a data driven policy making. An evidence based policy making, a data driven policy making will lead to a better targeting of the welfare, and it will be also setting the right precedent. Going forward, there will be the efforts for a better targeting of the reservation benefits, and there may be reforms in the reservation architecture also. But there are certain arguments against the exclusion of the creamy layer from the benefits of reservation for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Those arguments include that it will increase the administrative burden, because that will need the collection of a lot of data, and that data collection will be resource consuming as well as time consuming, and it will increase the administrative cost also, and it will require the technology, the software also to be updated accordingly. And at the same time, the criteria for sub-classification, it has to include specific parameters and specific thresholds, the income thresholds, etc., and they will be debatable. It may lead to the political risks. For example, the sub-classification may be done to ensure there is political currency which is gained out of it rather than ensuring equitable benefits, and there might be vote bank politics. It may even increase the social tensions also. For example, it may lead to the pitting of the most marginalized groups within the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes against the affluent SC/ST groups, and it might cause an increased legal cost also. For example, they may lead to the litigations, a series of litigations against the parameters which are chosen for the sub-classification in each state among the SCs and STs. Now, what can be the probable impact of the exclusion of the creamy layer from the reservation benefits for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes? Economically looking, it can reduce the inequality within the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. It can lead to the Lorenz curve moving closer to the line of equality. We discussed the concepts of Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient when we were discussing the topic of inequality. This is the 45-degree line of equality. If the creamy layer is excluded from the reservation benefits, then the Lorenz curve will be moving closer to the line of equality and the Gini coefficient will be moving closer to zero. This move will also be Kaldor-Hicks efficient. Kaldor-Hicks efficiency is a better measure as compared to the Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality is achieved when the goods are so distributed, the resources are so distributed that somebody cannot become better off unless someone else is becoming worse off. That is the achievement of Pareto optimality. But it does not consider the initial inequality. If there is initial inequality in distribution itself, that is not considered. Whereas the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency ensures that we can go ahead and redistribute resources even at the cost of somebody becoming worse off. if it leads to a net gain. The net welfare gain, even if somebody is gaining at the cost of a small loss of another person, and the person who is gaining can compensate for the loss of another person, and still there is a net welfare gain, that can still be termed as Kaldor-Hicks efficient. So therefore the exclusion of the creamy layer from the reservation benefits may lead to a small loss to the person who is excluded from the reservation benefit, but that person is already having a better social standing, better economic status as compared to the most marginalized people, most marginalized groups within the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Therefore that move will be Kaldor-Hicks efficient. When we compare it with the global models, India's model is based upon the evidence-based policy making, therefore, and we are targeting the intra-group disparities through this move. Whereas when we look at the other countries, for example in Malaysia, the new economic policy that gave blanket ethnic quotas, and within that the Bhumi Putera etc., and the elite captured most of the quotas and it ignored the rural marginalization. So what can be the recommendations that we can give? One, we can promote the holding of regular socio-economic surveys so that the data is collected continuously. For example, if there is a redistribution of welfare within the scheduled caste through the exclusion of the creamy layer, it may lead to the dominant scheduled caste groups benefits coming down, but it will increase the benefits that may be redistributed to the marginalized scheduled caste groups. And there can be sunset clauses also put in place. For example, the subclassification of the groups, it can be done every decade, once in 10 years, and there can be a creamy layer framework which can be put in place specifying accurate income criterias, the thresholds can be specified, and there can be political safeguards also which can be put in place. For example, rather than giving it in the hands of the political leaders only who can exploit it for the vote bank politics, we can set up independent commissions also, and there can be awareness campaigns also taken up so that the most marginalized sections, they are at least aware of the benefits which they can avail of. There is a means practice question as well. Should the concept of creamy layer be applied to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the context of reservations? Examine the arguments for and against such an exclusion with reference to the constitutional principles and judicial pronouncements. Please try to write it. The next article is related to Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Amendment Bill 2025, which has been introduced recently. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Before coming to the recent IBC amendment, let's discuss the provisions of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Under the code, the creditors including operational as well as financial are included. It applies to individuals, companies as well as partnerships. But the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code does not apply to the willful defaulters. Under this, an insolvency professional prepares a plan which is submitted to the Committee of Creditors, and if approved, then it is submitted to the National Company Law Tribunal. There are two processes under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The first process is the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process, and the second is Pre-Packaged Insolvency Resolution Process, which is for the MSMEs, the micro, small and medium enterprises. Now let's also understand the process which is undertaken for the insolvency resolution under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. If a corporate is defaulting, a corporate which has taken the loan defaults on payments, then the application can be given for the corporate insolvency resolution process. This application is given under section 6 of the IBC. But for that, minimum default for its coverage under the corporate insolvency resolution process has to be more than 1 crore rupees. And therefore, the National Company Law Tribunal or the tribunal can be approached. The National Company Law Tribunal will have 14 days to either admit the application for CIRP or to reject it. Once admitted, there will be a deadline of 330 days for the insolvency resolution process to be completed. Now, once it has been admitted, then the insolvency resolution professional will take control of the assets and the operations of the defaulter, of the corporate defaulter, and the insolvency resolution professional will coordinate the constitution of a committee. The committee of the creditors which have given loan to the corporate defaulter. This committee of the creditors will determine the viability. the viability of the company, the corporate, whether it can be restructured or it has to be liquidated. This committee of creditors appoints an insolvency professionals. The insolvency professional examines the proposals for a resolution plan, whether it can be restructured or merged, etc. The eligible plans, they are given to the committee of creditors. The committee of creditors has to approve it, else the company goes for liquidation. At least 66% of the committee of creditors has to approve it, and then it is submitted to the tribunal for the consideration, the National Company Law Tribunal. Now the amendment bill has been introduced for the amendment of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. It expects the expedition of the resolution and reduction of the delays. The mandatory NCLT timelines have been prescribed under it also. The admission has to be done within 14 days and the resolution plan has to be approved within 30 days once submitted to it. And the out of court creditor initiated resolution is also promoted to ensure there is faster insolvency resolution, more cost effective resolution, minimal disruption of the business so that the money of the creditors is not lost, and there is easing of the burden on the judicial systems as well. The amendment bill provides that there should be maximization of the value of the asset so that the interests of the stakeholders, the creditors, is protected. For that, the CIRP can be restored also by the National Company Law Tribunal, and in exceptional cases, if there is no resolution plan is approved and there is a request from the committee of creditors, then it can be restored as well. And the amendment bill seeks to enhance the governance and the compliance as well. For that, it puts in place a group insolvency framework also. This can be done voluntarily, that there can be a voluntary joint resolution of the stressed entities within a domestic corporate group. And for ensuring there is cross-border insolvency framework, again the bill promotes easier access for the creditors to the overseas assets of the stressed companies so that they can recover their dues. And the bill reinforces the clean slate principle. That is, if the resolution plan is approved by the committee of creditors, then after that no claims will lie against the corporate debtor. Then the corporate debtor gets a clean slate. The next article is related to ration at your doorstep, that is related to the food security schemes of various states. This is important in GS3 under the topic Public Distribution System, Objectives, Functioning, Limitations, Revamping, and the Issues of Buffer Stock and Food Security. Before coming to the article, let's first discuss the National Food Security Act 2013. It governs the public distribution system. As per the National Food Security Act, 2/3 of the total population of India has to be covered on the basis of the census 2011. As per the NFSA, 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population get subsidized food grains for two categories of beneficiaries, that is Antyodaya Ann Yojana households and the priority households. 35 kg of food grain is given per Antyodaya Ann Yojana household per month, whereas for the priority households, per person per month 5 kg of food grain is given. The identification of the beneficiaries or the households, it is done by the respective state governments or the union territories. They can frame their own criteria as well for the identification of the beneficiaries under the National Food Security Act. And the NFSA also promotes the women empowerment, as it recognizes the eldest woman of the beneficiary household who is more than 18 years as the head of the family for the issuing of the ration cards and for the distribution of the food grains under the National Food Security Act. There is a grievance redressal mechanism also provided under the National Food Security Act 2013. It provides for the constitution of the state food commissions, district grievance redressal officers, the vigilance committees also, and it promotes the disclosure of the records related to the PDS operations. To enhance transparency, the records of the beneficiaries of the PDS, they are published online, and the assistance is provided to the states and the union territories for meeting the expenditure on the intrastate transportation, handling, as well as the dealer's margin for the fair price shops as well. Now coming to the article describes various state schemes for the food security going for the doorstep delivery of the food grains. For example, in Tamil Nadu, there is a scheme of Thayu Manavar Thitam, which promotes the home delivery of the ration products for the senior citizens and the persons with disabilities. And Tamil Nadu provides for the universal public distribution system. There is no targeted system there. 95% of the fair price shops which are run in Tamil Nadu are run by the cooperative societies, whereas the national average of the percentage of the fair price shops which are run by cooperative societies is just about 20%. And there are also about 2500 mobile ration shops also in Tamil Nadu for the remote and hilly areas for the distribution of the food grains. Likewise, in Kerala, there is the OPAM scheme, through which the auto rickshaw drivers they deliver rations to the elderly and the disabled. In Karnataka, there is the Ann Suvidha scheme, which provides for the delivery of the food grains for those who are aged more than 75 years. In Andhra Pradesh, also there is doorstep delivery, which is now restricted to only those who are 65 plus years old or who are disabled. When we look at the legality of it, the National Food Security Act does not mandate doorstep delivery, but under Section 32 of the National Food Security Act, it does not prevent the state governments for coming up with their own schemes in addition to that. So the Section 32 also is providing for the state governments to go for the doorstep delivery of the rations as well. The next article is related to the utilization of artificial intelligence in the financial sector. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and science and technology developments and their applications. Before coming to the article, let's understand how do the financial institutions use artificial intelligence, what are the benefits and challenges in its usage in the finance sector. The financial institutions use AI for the algorithmic trading. That is when they are purchasing or selling the stocks, then they are going for the high frequency trading where the AI is analyzing the data, analyzing the news, analyzing the sentiment in real time and performing the trades. And the AI is used for the credit scoring and risk assessment as well. That is when the loans are given out, when the credit is given out, risk assessment is done by utilizing the AI, analyzing the profile of the customer, and it minimizes the human bias, human errors in the credit scoring. AI is used in the customer service also. For example, the chatbots, they perform routine inquiries, they give replies via the natural language processing. AI is used for the fraud detection and prevention also. For example, identifying and analyzing the transaction patterns to spot the anomalies in real time so that the fraud is prevented altogether. AI is used for the insurance underwriting also and for the processing of the claims, because the AI, it can process the images, it automates the risk assessment and it automates the claims also via natural language processing and the image recognition also. AI is used in portfolio management and the investment strategies as well by the traders. When it comes to the benefits of the AI in finance, it improves the risk management. Therefore, it reduces the chances of fraud and the market volatility risks as well. It enhances the efficiency via automation, and it personalizes the customer experiences also through chatbots, for example, and it has the advantage of scalability. When the transaction volumes grow, then the AI will be helpful in the scalability as well as the promotion of the financial inclusion also. But there are certain challenges also in the utilization of the artificial intelligence in finance. For example, the algorithms, they also have biases, the algorithmic biases in the credit decision making, and also there is the black box phenomenon as well. For example, the AI models, how they are making decisions, not everything can be explained, and there are the risks related to the cyber security also, the risk of the theft of data, the privacy concerns, and also there is a regulatory uncertainty as well regarding the usage of AI in finance, as there are no global standards regarding the same. Now coming to the article, the RBI has come up with a framework for responsible and ethical enablement of artificial intelligence in the finance sector, that is the free AI in the financial sector. The RBI says that there can be 7 sutras for the adoption of the free AI in the financial sector, for which trust is the foundation, people first, innovation over restraint, fairness and equity, accountability, understandable by design and safety, and resilience and sustainability. These sutras can be adopted for the adoption of AI in the financial sector. The RBI focuses upon 2 themes. innovation enablement and the risk mitigation. For promoting innovation regarding the usage of AI in the financial sector, the focus can be on infrastructure, policy and capacity. For example, the infrastructure can be shared to democratize the access to data and the computation capability. The creation of an AI innovation sandbox can be done, and the development of indigenous financial sector specific AI models can be done. For the mitigation of the risk, the focus can be on governance, protection and assurance. For that, the RBI recommends the board approved AI policy should be constituted by the regulated entities, and there can be an expansion of the product approval processes. And the consumer protection can be done by putting in place the frameworks and audits to include the AI related audits also. And the cyber security practices can be augmented, and there can be incident reporting frameworks also put in place. The next article is related to South China Sea. The context behind it is that the USA has briefly deployed 2 warships in the South China Sea after a Chinese collision. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests. Regarding the South China Sea, the geopolitical thinkers say that whoever controls these shipping lanes will rule this Asian century. It is so significant. So what is the significance of the South China Sea? One, it has immense oil reserves. About 11 billion barrels of oil reserves are there in the South China Sea, and it has rich fishing grounds also. As per BBC, about 10% of the world's fishes are in the South China Sea region, and it is an important trade route also. As per United Nations, about 20% of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea. India's stake is also there, as 55% of India's trade with the Indo-Pacific region passes nearby the South China Sea region. And we have the energy stake also. For example, we had an agreement with Vietnam since 2011 to go for the oil exploration in the South China Sea. And we have the strategic calculations also. For example, the freedom of navigation, the maritime security, as well as the Act East policy. For that, we need to ensure that there is the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea also. But there are disputes regarding the South China Sea, and primarily because of the claims made by China. China claims about 90% of the South China Sea, claiming that anything up to the 9-dash line belongs to China, and this is up to 2000 kilometers off the mainland of China and within a few hundred kilometers of Vietnam, Philippines, etc. And on the Spratly Island, it has been building artificial islands, container port facilities, military buildings, and even building an airstrip also. It has been having the control of Paracel Island since 1974. Regarding the Scarborough Shoal also, in 2016 there was a judgment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in Hague that the China does not have any legal basis behind the claims on the Scarborough Shoal, and it is violating the exclusive economic zone rights of Philippines, and it even caused an irreversible damage to the marine environment in the region. And recently it even installed a barricade near the Scarborough Shoal. The Woody Island has also been militarized by China by installing the fighter jets there. So what can be the way forward regarding the South China Sea dispute? One, it has to be resolved through dialogue by putting in place a political framework. At the same time, there can be a quiet diplomacy also, because the solution through the legal means only, they may be limited. And at the same time, there can be efforts to put in place the legally binding code of conduct also. The next article is related to National Green Tribunal. This is important in GS2 under the topic Statutory, Regulatory and Various Quasi-Judicial Bodies. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the NGT. The NGT is a statutory body enacted under the NGT Act 2010, and it is for the effective and expeditious disposal of the cases which are related to the environmental protection and environmental conservation. It has the expertise in the cases which are related to the disputes involving multidisciplinary issues, and it is not bound by the Civil Procedure Code. Rather, it is guided by the principles of natural justice. The NGT disposes of the applications or appeals finally within 6 months of filing. The principal bench of NGT is in New Delhi, and it has regional benches also in Bhopal, Pune, Kolkata and Chennai. When it comes to the composition of the NGT, it comprises of a chairperson who is a retired Supreme Court judge, and it comprises of some judicial members who can be the retired judge of the High Court or the district judge or additional district judge of 10 years, or the advocates having the experience in the cases of the environmental law, and the expert members also, who will be professionals having 15 years experience in the environmental conservation and forest conservation. There are a few landmark judgments also given by the NGT. For example, in Almitra Patel versus Union of India, the NGT imposed a total ban on the open burning of the waste on any land, even the landfills also. In Srinagar, Bandh Apda Sangharsh Samiti versus Alaknanda Hydropower Company, the Alaknanda Hydropower Company was ordered to pay compensation in the Uttarakhand floods case, and the judgment was based on the principle of the polluter pays. In the Art of Living Yamuna River Foundation case 2016, the NGT imposed a fine of 5 crores on the foundation for environmental damage caused by the event conducted by the foundation. In the Ganga pollution case in 2017, the NGT directed the state governments to set up sewage treatment plants and regulate industrial discharges. Now, coming to the article, the Union Environment Ministry has ordered the appointment of 2 judicial members and 4 expert members to the NGT, which is currently functioning below its sanctioned strength. Until the latest order, the NGT had only 5 expert members and 6 judicial members. Now there will be 7 expert members, with the number of judicial members remaining same. Section 4 of the NGT states that the tribunal shall consist of not less than 10 but a maximum of 20 full-time judicial members and the same number of expert members. A judicial member can be a former judge of High Court or district judge or additional district judge of 10 years, or an advocate with substantial experience in environmental litigation before NGT, High Court or Supreme Court. Thank you.